Hey, I'm Melvin Van Peebles. Look, for those of you who don't know much about it, Akashic is the best independent book publisher in the whole land. We gotta give him a little celebration interest. He is part of one of my tunes, the Apple Stretching. Since Akashic, he is here in New York. So why don't we try it out? The tin can go clattering down the lane, and drowsy bum thinks it's thunder and pulls the news over your head to stop the rain. No, it ain't Judgment Day, no, it ain't Armageddon. It's just the apple stretching and yawning, just morning, just New York, and a castle putting its feet on the floor. Support Akashic.
Breadfruit Media is a US-based podcast production company that prioritizes the development and production of podcasts by people of Caribbean heritage. Founded by Jamaican-born Carrie Ann Reed Brown of the Carry On Friends podcast, she created Breadfruit Media to support representation of the Caribbean. Check out Breadfruit Media produced shows including BCLF Always Lit, Bridge to You, Carry On Friends, Millennial Health Podcast, Strictly Facts, a guide to Caribbean history and culture, and Style and Vibes. Listen to any of these shows on your favorite podcast platforms. To learn more about Breadfruit Media, visit their website at www.breadfruitmedia.com.
Hello, it's Shakira. My short story collection In Time of Need is now available as an audiobook, so please get it, and if you enjoy, leave a review or a rating.
You good for nothing, Father wants to come for you in an hour. It's my first time on an airplane. I can't believe I'm on an airplane. Leon hit me again. I don't think lunch and meat lips would be appropriate anymore, you being an officer of the law and all. I first met Betty when her son stole my car.
Shakira Bourne's In Time of Need, the audiobook, is now available on Nook, Apple, Scribd, Google, and wherever audiobooks are.
Mr. Mears was dead, and there lay Mr. Mears in his childhood bed, snoring with the saliva running down his chin. When two people get married, what does happen? How it is you don't know what is married, you foolish boy? You just go in the church with all your family and friends, but that not important. The part that matter is later on when you cut the cake. That umpire finish. That's why I don't play cricket no more. Cause I just walk with a Collins and I would give one of them umpires a big lash with it.
Storyshift presents the audiobook for In Time of Need by Shakira Bourne. Get your copy wherever audiobooks are sold.
Hello, hello. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from. We're happy to have you here for the BCLF 2021. Welcome to Espiritismo y Superstitions, which builds on the powerful installment of the Brooklyn Caribbean Lit Fest 2020 folklore panel, wherein it was surmised that folklore was born to help our ancestors make sense of the worlds in which they lived. The Brooklyn Caribbean Lit Fest, which is lovingly called BCLF, is a celebration of culture as expressed through the pen of the storyteller and the voice of the poet. It exists to blaze a trail for Caribbean literature through its annual festival, podcasts, vibrant events, and conversations. The ever-evolving year-long programming is keen on exploring the rich depth of Caribbean culture and its centuries-long tradition of storytelling. BCLF works tirelessly to empower and motivate the hidden storyteller of Caribbean descent to find the courage to tell his, her, or their own story and write from the unique lens of that heritage. My name is Simone Dalton, and I'm your host this afternoon. Many thanks to the powerhouses behind the BCLF for inviting me to participate again this year. I am thrilled to be joined by three fascinating storytellers whose writing has inhabited my imagination and dreams, and dare I say, even reignited a few childhood fears over the past couple of weeks for me. I urge you to visit the BCLF website to purchase a copy of their books, and that link will be shared with you very shortly on screen. Now, please join me in welcoming Rafael Ocasio. Rafael is a Latin Americanist and a specialist in revolutionary Cuban literature. The Charles A. Dana Professor of Spanish at Agnes Scott College in Decatur, Georgia. His many books include Reinaldo Arenas, Cuba's Political and Sexual Outlaw, A Gay Cuban in Exile, Afro-Cuban Costumbrismo, From Plantations to the Slums, and in Bristol, Rhode Island, and Manzanares, Cuba, Slavery Connection, The Diary of George Howe. Other areas of his published research are Afro-Cuban and revolutionary Cuban children's literature and reflections of Santeria, the Afro-Cuban religious belief in mainstream revolutionary Cuban literature. He has also done extensive research on the Puerto Rican novelist and poet Judith Ortiz Coffer, an important contemporary Latina writer. He's the author of Race and Nation in Puerto Rican Folklore, Franz Boas and John Alden Mason in Puerto Rico, and Folktales from the Hills of Puerto Rico, which he'll be sharing with us today. Thank you for joining us, Rafael.
Thank you.
Next is Cadwell Turnbull. Cadwell is the author of The Lesson, and his second book, No Gods, No Monsters, just launched this past Wednesday. So BCLF is bringing you the greatest and the latest. He is a graduate of North Carolina State University's Creative Writing, MFA in Fiction and English. MFA in Fiction and English MA in Linguistics. Turnbull is also a graduate of Clarion West 2016. His short fiction has appeared in The Verge, Lightspeed Nightmare, and Asimov's science fiction, and a number of anthologies. His nightmare story, Loneliness is in Your Blood, was selected for the Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy Year 2018. His Lightspeed story, Jump, was selected for the year's Best Science Fiction and Fantasy of 2019 and was featured on LeVar Burton Reads. His novel, The Lesson, was the winner of the 2020 Newcomb Institute Literary Award in the debut category. It was also shortlisted for the VCU Cabell Award and longlisted for the Massachusetts Board Book Award. Turnbull teaches creative writing at North Carolina State University. Welcome, Cadwell.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And our third author today is Jamie Figueroa. See, I told you the Spanish is going to get me. Figueroa. Jamie is an Afro-Taino Boricua by way of Ohio and a longtime resident of northern New Mexico. Her writing has appeared in Agni, McSweeney's American Short Story Fiction, Emergence Magazine, and Catapult, among other journals. She's an associate professor at the Institute of American Indian Arts. Jamie's novel, Brother, Sister, Mother, Explorer, debuted in March 2021. Welcome to you all.
Thank you.
So, my head is full, I have to start by saying this, and still spinning from considering all of the possible ways we can enter into today's discussion. And I could literally talk to the three of you for hours. But since we only have about an hour and 15 minutes today, I thought our conversation would be best guided by your reading selections, which will be interspersed throughout our time together. And to those of you watching, we definitely want to hear from you. So you can pop your questions into the chat of whichever platform you are on, and I will aim to share them with our authors at the end of our discussion, and we'll try to get through as many of them as possible. The BCLF team is also behind the scenes looking out for your questions should I miss any of them. So let's start with a question to all of you. And in my intro, I shared that BCLF considers folklore as being born to help our ancestors make sense of the worlds in which they lived. I think that all of your books speak to this tradition in their own ways. My question is, what are some of the things, I like to call them your provocations, that you were trying to make sense of in your worlds through these books and their stories within? And I'd like to start with you, Jamie.
Yeah, I think, coming from a place and reading, especially in the Western canon, a literature base that where I have felt marginalized, othered, exoticized, right? And while there have been incredible contributions by other Puerto Rican writers and also writers across the Caribbean, to have this constant pervasive feeling of being sort of supplemental or not feeling a kind of weight and heft through perspective and voice. That alongside generational trauma, that alongside missing information around identity, gaps in identity and in family stories, rumors more so than a grippable, graspable knowing. We're all sort of the kind of environment where I feel like I moved into this work and really received this work and listened deeply to this work. And a lot of the responses that came through the characters sort of matched needs that I also had. For voices and perspectives to be considered as absolutely integral and essential. So I can say that's some of an answer to speak to that question.
That's a great start. No, I definitely resonated with that idea of that not knowing or that needing to fill those gaps. How about you, Cadwell? What provocations were you trying to answer, make sense of with your book?
When I was a kid, I used to go by my grandmother in Hidden Valley. It's in St. Thomas. It's a projects. And I would play with the neighborhood kids and we would, run around, and there was a place up the road that sold specials. I don't know if, y'all, they're like little icy pops and then candy and all that stuff. And, around, like 3-4 p.m., we would want to get a little treat. And so the neighborhood kids would run up the road. And on the way up, there was this abandoned house on the side of the street that all the windows were closed up and it was all dark inside. And I don't know where the story came from, but we thought that Cowfoot lady lived in that house. And we would all run really fast past that house and then run really fast back after we got our candy and specials. And, that kind of like coexistence of like the strange being normalized within the culture and then and real life next to it. Like it was only a concern when we were passing the house and coming back. And then we would go back to doing what we were doing. And it was as if there was anything happening supernatural down the street. Right. And, you know, it feels to me like that seems to be a unique experience of diaspora, but specifically the Caribbean, the way that myth, like it changes and morphs over time. And then it becomes really, really close to, you know, the normal sense of being and operating in the world. And as like a kid, that was always, you know, dreaming and thinking about things and, you know, wondering about the nature of existence. It was something that I felt like nurtured me, and it came into the work. And so that, you know, part of it is just creating characters that have that same kind of very dreamlike, mysterious way of looking at the world or experiencing the world, and legitimizing that as a legitimate way of looking at the world.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah. It's so interesting I think that sense of the closeness and, you know, what is real, what is not real, or what the myth, it rings throughout all three of your works. I think for sure, definitely. And how about you, Raphael? What was provoking you?
So piggybacking on what Cadwell just said, I should emphasize that I am a literary person in the sense that I teach literature. I do not write literature, and I'll go over this later. But what interested me in the connection with Cadwell's point is that the Puerto Rican oral stories that I will be reading often emphasize plot lines within the boundaries of the real and the spiritual, giving way to a unique perspective, call it supernatural, that we often refer to in the literary world as magical realism. However, as Caldwell and Jamie will emphasize in their own reading, we have the experience, the personal experience, that this is not literary, that indeed we have had the experience of having witnessed certain situations that cannot be explained through rational explanations. And that is precisely why I like the stories that I will be reading to you, how these characters face those environments and those situations as if it was normal.
Well, I think that's an excellent segue to get into your reading. Raphael, if you wouldn't mind sharing with us your first selection.
Great. Thank you. But before I start, let me thank you, Simone Dalton, for organizing this panel. And many thanks, muchas gracias to the Brooklyn Literary Caribbean Festival for your kind invitations, and warm greetings from Atlanta, everybody. But before I start with my first reading, let me give you a short introduction to the stories that appeared published in my edited anthology called Folk Stories from the Hills of Puerto Rico, Cuentos Folclóricos de las Montañas de Puerto Rico. My anthology is a bilingual collection of representative oral stories that were collected in Puerto Rico in 1915. Considered today among the largest collections of oral folklore from any Spanish-speaking country or territory, being Puerto Rico never had been a country, the stories were collected in rural areas of the island as part of the scientific survey of Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. Large field work explorations that included anthropological field research. Franz Boas, the founding father of American anthropology, was in charge of the anthropological field research, which included mapping of Capa, today known as Caguana, the largest Taino religious ballpark in the Caribbean. Boas also supervised John Alden Mason, who was in charge of collecting of hundreds and hundreds of samples of oral folk tales. This is the subject of my book, Race and Nation in Puerto Rican Folklore, which describes Boas's and Mason's whereabouts in Puerto Rico from 1914 to 1915. Honoring the fact that the stories were collected in Spanish, In my anthology, Folk Stories from the Hills of Puerto Rico, I edited the original cuentos in Spanish and provided my own translations into English. This afternoon, I will be reading samples both in Spanish and in English. My first story, Cofresí in the Mysterious Palace, Cofresí en el Palacio Misterioso, highlights the figure of the legendary pirate, Roberto Cofresí, while explaining the supernatural spiritist reasons that allowed Cofresí to bury his treasures all over Puerto Rico's western coast. Cofresí in the Mysterious Palace. Cofresí was a robber who buried what he stole. One day, he gathered together 7 mules that, as I heard, he owned, and he left to rob people. He arrived at a gorgeous house with a beautiful golden balcony. At once, Cofresí broke the door so easily that no one heard a peep. He went into the house, looked around, and came upon 4 beautiful maidens. As he came near them, he noticed came nothing. As Cofresí reached out to touch them, he found nothing. This beautiful house was governed by the devil. Once the vision of the maidens stopped, unable to see anything else, Cofresí started to leave, feeling fearful and angry. As he was leaving the house, he heard a hoarse voice, at moments sounding sad and happy, but he could not make out what the voice was saying. Cofresí went into another house that looked much like a palace. There, he loaded 7 mules with money. He set out into the wilderness, but he became utterly confused. Far in the distance, he saw the same odd house he had left behind, the one where he had heard the strange voice that he could not understand. Cofresí approached the mysterious house and knocked at the door. A beautiful maiden came to meet him. She was wearing a very beautiful green dress adorned in silk, and her fingers were covered with rings. While Cofresí was staring at her, she transformed herself into an extraordinary figure whose soft hand hardened as he reached out to greet her. He was brave, though. The maiden spoke. She told him that if Cofresí trusted her, he could leave all his money there. The house could move anywhere he so desired. Underneath it, there was a subterranean cave filled with water where he could bury his money. This is why it is said that there is a lot of money buried in Puerto Rico. Cofresí always went around burying anything he stole. Cofresí en el Palacio Misterioso. Cofresí era un ladrón que robaba para enterrar. Cierta vez cogió sus 6 mulas que según me han contado tenía y se fue a robar. Llegó a una casa muy hermosa, cuyo balcón era dorado y muy bonito. Rompió una puerta tan fácilmente que nadie lo oyó. Cofresí entró, buscó y solo vio 4 hermosas doncellas. Se acercó a ellas. Cofresí vio que se habían hecho nada, pues cuando las iba a tocar no encontraba nada. Era que esa hermosa casa estaba gobernada por el demonio. Después de esa visión no vio nada más. Cofresí salió atemorizado y con mucho coraje. Cuando fue a salir oyó una voz ronca, triste a momentos y alegre a otros, pero no entendió lo que la voz decía. Cofresí se fue a otra casa que parecía un palacio, donde cargó de dinero sus 7 mulas. Atravesó el monte con ellas, pero tenía dudas porque distinguía a lo lejos la misma casa que había dejado tras de sí, allá donde no había entendido la voz que le hablaba. Se acercó a la casa misteriosa, llamó a la puerta y salió a responder una hermosa joven con un vestido verde muy bonito, adornado con seda y llenos de sortijas los dedos. Se le quedó mirando y se transformó en una figura extraordinaria que había tendido su mano. Al saludarla, Cofresí notó que las manos de la mujer eran blandas y se iban endureciendo, pero él era valiente. La joven le dijo que muy bien podía, si tenía confianza, dejar su dinero allí. Esa casa se conducía donde quisiera y debajo de ella iba quedando un subterráneo con agua, donde podía siempre guardar su dinero. Por eso se dice que en Puerto Rico hay mucho dinero enterrado. Cofresí estaba enterrando lo que robaba.
Thank you so much for that reading, Rafael. When I read the story of Cofresi in folk stories from Puerto Rico, I was struck by the connection between the human and spirit worlds, but also by his history. And I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about who the pirate Cofresi was and why you felt you wanted to include his story in your collection.
Yes. So to start with, Cofresi was a very famous character in his own lifetime. He was born in 1791 in the Western Coast, in the town of Cabo Rojo, and he was executed in 1825. But he was not any kind of pirate, unlike the pirates of his time. Cofresi became a kind of a Robin Hood-like character. He would steal from the rich and give to the poor. But what's more interesting of him is that Cofresi became known as the person who would defend his national origin of being Puerto Rican. And remember, this is before the independence of most of the Latin American countries. He was, as I said, he was executed in 1825. Around that time, most of the Latin American countries had become independent. But during his mature lifetime, he lived in in what we called the Spanish colonies. And as a pirate, he defended that Puerto Rican national identity to the point that often Cofresi is seen in Puerto Rico as one of the first historical characters to profess that national identity as Puerto Rican and not Spaniard.
Wow.
And he's very popular still today. There's stories about him all throughout the island, not only on the Western coast. And the stories are for adults and for children.
Oh, fascinating. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Cadwell, I wanted to move on to you sharing your selection for us, your first selection, and then we'll get into a little bit more about that first reading.
Okay, thank you. And yeah, I just want to say thanks as well to you, Simone, for organizing this, and thank you for the Brooklyn Caribbean Lit Fest for inviting me here. It's an honor to be on this panel with these great writers. Appreciate you all. So I'm going to read from the book, No Gods, No Monsters, just came out, and I'm going to, read a bit far into it, but hopefully not too many spoilers. All right, so from chapter 42. Sandra was an only child until she was 7. Her parents doted on her, amused by her every action. She shone under their attention. Her mother and father both came from families strong with the gift, so they weren't surprised when Sandra started showing signs of a keen nose and a sensitivity to magic. Our daughter, her father said to her mother when Sandra first picked up their scent. He was glowing with such pride. One night she woke up and caught the scent of strange magic in the air. She sat up in bed, stared into the darkness. Nothing was there, but Sandra felt the chill of warning slide through her. She got up and turned on the light. Nothing still, but her door was slightly ajar. She kept her door closed. She walked over, closed the door, and turned off the light, then smelled it again on her way back to bed. Sandra woke the next morning to her father watching her. He was just standing there, his entire body tensed in anticipation. "Don't move," he said. And then she smelled it again, that same touch of wild magic, only closer now, right in her nose, so ripe it burned. She slowly turned in the direction of the smell, and that's when she saw it. Something solid had been lying right next to her, was now lying next to her. The bedsheet squirmed, moved by something that appeared as nothing. Her father growled. "I'm sorry," came a small voice. "I didn't know, please." It was a young girl's voice, and she was crying. In her skin, the girl was an accumulation of disturbing parts: skinny arms and legs, distended stomach. Her face was a sunken thing, dark circles around protruding eyes. The girl reminded Sandra of an owl, hardly blinking in her quiet observance of the world. Sandra imagined the little girl in other people's houses, in their corners, watching them eat or sleep or use the bathroom. Those same owl eyes, seeing everything. It made Sandra itch, that knowledge, and she couldn't help but imagine all the private things the girl might have glimpsed when Sandra didn't know she was there. "You would have noticed," her father said, flaring his nostrils, but Sandra found no comfort in that. She remembered that night, sleeping beside her and not knowing, those owl eyes on her as she dreamed. They eventually named the girl Sonia. Her father sat Sandra down and said, "She is a succulent. Do you remember the stories I told you about them?" Sandra squirmed in her seat. Yes, she remembered. Creatures who could remove their skin and live off blood. It was old magic, like hers, but rarer. They were all supposed to be extinct. "She has no one to care for her, no one to keep her safe," her father said. Sandra knew the rest before he got there. "We've decided to take her in. It's done." Now Sandra and Sonia would share a room, twin beds on opposite walls. Now the owl eyes would watch her sleep every night. Sandra tried to protest. "She's your sister now. Be a good sister," her mother said. Sandra had tears in her eyes. "I don't want a sister." Sonia was sitting at the kitchen table with a bowl of Fruit Loops, watching the whole argument play out in the living room. Sandra's mother glared at her. "I won't accept this behavior." And Sandra didn't dare say another word. That first night was terrible. She twisted and turned, unable to sleep. Sonia wasn't a talker. She was used to running around at night, so she wasn't sleeping either. She just sat on her bed, so still, so quiet, her breath a whisper. Sonia wouldn't speak either. It was a war waged through silence, weeks of it, no exchanges between them. As time passed, Sonia got healthier, her face filling out, arms and legs strengthening. She was beginning to look like something nearer to human. Sonia's parents doted on the wretched girl, making sure she was clean and fed. They were teaching her how to read and write. They were buying her clothes. Sonia liked to watch the news, so they watched it with her every night. Sonia spent a lot of time in her room now, which was Sonia's. Sandra extended her silences to her parents, rejected their shows of affection, ignored their apologies for spending so much time with Sonia, their calls for her to make Sonia feel at home. It wasn't Sonia's home, and they weren't Sonia's parents. She was a monster they had to stop from removing its own skin at night. Several times they found the skin lying around the house and had to sniff her out or else wait for her to return for it. Sandra hated the sight of it, pink on the inside, rubbery and wet, the soft hair sticking out from pores, the greasy smell like burnt oil and raisins. She held her grudge for months, trying to wait them out, make them suffer so they'd get rid of her. Sandra could not imagine ever loving Sonia as a sister. Sandra was young and never considered time with her parents to be anything but infinite. They would eventually return to loving her and only her, she thought, and their lives would continue in uninterrupted love forever. On all counts, Sandra was wrong.
Thank you so much, Cadwell. And my paws are officially on the end again. Just hearing you read that brought me back so many memories of hearing similar stories. One of the successes, and mind you, there are many with No Gods, No Monsters, is that, and I'm borrowing from BCLF's description of today's event here, it seamlessly blends myth and reality. And you spoke to this a little bit in the earlier response. so that it's hard to tell where one begins and the other ends. And I really want to ask you the impossible question of how you did it. But instead, I think I will ask you this. And it is, can you tell us what kinds of choices did you make on the page to create the worlds of Sandra and her family?
Well, I mean, the first thing I did was try to think about, what their lives are like that would be, I feel like anyone would be able to associate with. So there, it's a father and mother and an only child. And Sandra, is used to being an only child and is kind of been spoiled a little bit by it. And I felt like this is a story that, people would be able to grab onto. This is something that makes sense. And when Sonia shows up, it's creepy the way that she shows up, but the way that she settles into the family is almost like, a young child being born or another child being adopted into the family. And so Sandra, being the only child, feels very possessive of her parents and, sees Sonia as an enemy, and that relationship, matches things that, I've experienced growing up, being, I was an only child, but I was a baby. And so like having sibling rivalries and that kind of stuff, I felt like, those natural elements should be there in the story. And then there's also the supernatural elements. And with thinking about that, one of the things I figured pretty early on was that, all the monsters within this world would have heard of the other monsters within it. So there's the woo woo, which is Sandra and her family, and she's heard of the Sukuyan. Everyone has, and but she also has some intimate knowledge because her father knows a bit more because he's from that magical world. And so creating that parallel history was also part of it. Thinking about how someone within that world might respond to other things within that world was also part of it. And Sonia as a character actually showed up earlier for me. I wrote a story I wrote the story in 2016, but it got published in 2017. Loneliness is in Your Blood. And that was about a Sukuyan. And Sonia is a part of that story. So, I like to do this. I like to, create something and then take something else that I've, already been thinking about and kind of see how they relate to each other. And that was one of the ways that I tried to add some complexity to the story as well.
Excellent. Yeah, it certainly has worked. It's a good way to approach a project of this type, for sure. I love the relatability of it as well that you mentioned. Jamie, I would love to hear from you now with your first selection, and then we get into chatting a little bit more.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Simone. And thank you to BCLF. My heart is so full right now. And also listening to Raphael and to Caldwell, I just feel like all of this incredible inspiration and story life force, just welcoming it in and receiving it. So thank you to each of you as well. So I'm going to read just a couple pages from the first part of my book, Brother, Sister, Mother, Explore, which happens over a 3-day weekend, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, with a brother and a sister, Raphael and Rafina, who are in their late 20s, who have just lost their mother a few months before the story, the opening scene, the story begins. So we're still here in Friday, and I'll read a few pages. Before Rafina had spotted her brother under their mother's bed and forced him to bet his life, there had been a week of hide and seek in the house. Rafina locating stashes of Rosalinda's pain pills, hiding them, finding more. Rafa trailing her in an attempt to track the collection he'd amassed. While Rafa had banished himself to the space beneath his mother's bed, Rosalinda sat on the floor in the hallway, her back against the door. Rafina had to step over her. Each time she did, she'd strike her mother's shins with her cane. The mother ignored her daughter as the mother had a habit of doing. This, of course, made Rufina strike her harder and more often. Is this what you want for him? Rufina asked. To make him suffer more than you did when you were alive? For months? Enough. Be dead already. Notice what Rufina did not say. I hate you for leaving me. Every morning since her mother's ghostly resurrection, when Rufina woke, she willed it to be the day her mother was still alive. Instead, there was the mournful mother pulling at the hooks of distress lodged deep in her mournful son. Dead, not dead. It always has to be about you, Rufina said. Notice she did not say to her mother, I still need you. What do you know? Rosalinda said, finally giving in to Rufina's pestering. Her hair was chopped unevenly above her shoulders. That was Rufina's fault. You have no idea what this is about. Besides, you have your distractions. The earnest cop, baby, and your other stupid fantasies. Stupid fantasies being code for the explorer. Rufina's grieving for him after he'd left, her commitment to imagining his return. How many years had it been now? The age her child should be, nearly 15. She resisted the number, a sharp fact she would bend and remake into whatever she found most comforting. 3 weeks, 6 months. You still haven't. Rufina stopped. She was aiming for an insult, but lost her fire. This was not uncommon for Rufina to lose her words with her mother when she needed them as ammunition the most. What was it Rufina was going to say? You still haven't forgiven me? Or was it, you still don't love me like you love him? Of course, Rosalinda wasn't concerned with Rufina, or rather, it was her son she was concerned with, and there wasn't anything left for her daughter. Rufina wanted to protect Rafa, but couldn't find the words that would ward the mother off, trigger a phrase that would inflict hurt, cause the mother to recoil. Clearly, Rosalinda did not hesitate before attacking and won every round. Rosalinda wore her signature dress, one of the explorer's designs, custom made for her petite figure. Vertical ruffles ran down her, severe and crisp as fins. The neckline plunged in the front as well as the back. Around her shoulders, a huipil woven blue, purple, and green. Bracelets of assorted widths and metals stacked up and down both of her forearms, thick carved bands, stones larger than her knuckles piled onto her fingers, medallions for earrings hung down past her collarbones. Her neck was bare. There was the mole in the cup of her throat Rufina and Rafa would fight over. They each wanted to name it, to possess that tiny patch of skin. A bundle of pink and red sword lilies concealed her legs. Blush streaked each one of her cheeks, her lips hidden under an attack of fuchsia. The yellow and orange headdress of mums made her appear larger, however. Even in death, she was out of place, a refugee.
Thank you so much, Jamie. I keep thinking about that mole in the cup of her throat over and over again. It's one of my favorite lines in the book for sure. And the voice of your narrator throughout Brother, Sister, Mother, Explorer. I mean, the first word that comes to mind for me is addictive. It is just addictive. And I found myself nodding vigorously throughout the entire reading and saying out loud to the pages, yes, I saw that too. Like, it's just like, I want to, the narrator's wit and cunning reminded me of the trickster, that what we know about of like a Nancy. And at the same time, you managed to maintain a certain tug and pull between belief and disbelief, and yet what cannot be denied is the universal or the thing of grief, that underlies the story. And I'm wondering if you can both talk about the importance of maintaining that tug and pull, and then what is the significance of using grief as a grounding device?
Yeah, absolutely. The tug and pull was a bit of a challenge, because what I found was with the voice of the narrator, which is very much a voice of this place, Ciudad de Tres Hermanas, which is a fictional twin of Santa Fe, and also infused with aspects of San Juan, right? So by creating a fictional place, I could pour these experiences in some of these key relatable places, but also have the space to invent what was necessary, right? So wanting the narrator that is both comforting at times and also corrective,
Yes,
which to me very much feels like the mother archetype, right? And also being the voice of land, of presence, of land embodied, that has been paying attention for all time, right? And so absolutely they have wisdom to impart, right? And don't want the reader to miss out on any of these teachings that are inherently necessary and that have been unlearned for quite some time, right? And so in earlier drafts, the voice could get quite strong, and so I had to sort of pull it back, and there is this notion, right, that we have to trust our reader.
Yes.
But when you come from a BIPOC community, trusting your reader, who is your reader, there's many things that cannot be trusted for good reason.
Yes.
And so all of this, right, all of this was like feeding this exchange and this experience, and sort of ultimately from the narrator being guided myself, right? And learning to attune to what it was they felt was necessary in following that direction and guidance. And the thing that I can say about grief is, I think through the ongoing process of colonization, decolonization, and sorting out agency and dignity, and very much wanting to include relations and ancestry. Grief absolutely is interstitial fabric, fluid. It's absolutely, for me, what sort of holds everything together and makes possible the full experience of all the other emotions, which are absolutely our inheritance and our right, right? But it's like these characters are kind of overcome with grief. And through our main character, Rafina, it is through exercising and exorcising grief that she comes to what is just about to be joy, or the precipice of joy, where the novel ends. I think so much what happens in the overculture is this divorce between the seen and the unseen, the cycle of life, death, life, that we absolutely, I believe, are have to carry within us and keep close as sort of a talisman, right? And so it's also a challenge of to that point as well. Of how necessary.
Wow.
Yeah,
fantastic. So I just want to turn it back to the three of you at this point, and all of your books deliver a dose of the unexpected. That's what magic does. But I think what's particularly interesting to me is that it's doing this by way of a bit of a political current, that I see all through the three books. I'm reading about myth and superstition, but it's more than fantasy. Firstly, the very existence of these books, I believe, is a type of protest art. Specifically, Raphael, various protagonists in your work are non-white and often female. Jamie, your work interrogates the white tourist, and I kept thinking of Jamaica Kincaid's A Small Place when I was reading, particularly the opening section of your book. And it holds indigeneity as a connecting thread throughout the piece as well. Cadwell, earlier sections of your book are set against the backdrop of a US city that is often touted as the state's most liberal and progressive. The wit studies continuously show as one of the most racist as well in the US, and I happen to live in that city now. So do any of my observations surprise you as writers of your work? I know sometimes you don't think, I'm writing to be political, but I'm just wondering, does anything strike you as surprising, or perhaps you want to share a little bit more about what I've said?
I can start. So I should note that the stories were collected from rural areas in Puerto Rico. And what was outstanding of these stories was that for Mason and Boas to be able to collect the largest collection of oral folklore, they needed people to do it. And they decided that these people were going to be the people known for their abilities to tell stories. And these people were jibaros, as we call the inhabitants of rural areas, or peasants, but also there were children. Again, the goal of the project was to collect the largest number possible of oral samples. So what I found interesting of these stories are two things that will go to your point. The first point, that often the stories are very political. These are stories that reflect the poor areas of the rural campo, or the countryside, the Puerto Rican countryside back then, and we can make the argument that it's still suffering from poverty. Back then, high levels of illiteracy. There was terrible violence against women and children. Illnesses were very predominant in the countryside, and these situations are very much reflected in the stories as a political weapon, as you mentioned. However, your second point is that these stories also reflect how religious belief systems often warn people against bad behavior. And I will be talking about that in my two other selections. Why do we behave in the way in which we should behave? Or why should we behave in the proper manner? It's the center of many of these stories.
Okay, I'll go.
Yes.
So as Raphael was talking, I was thinking about what my own answer to this might be, and the best way I can do it is with another story. I also lived in Boston for a number of years, 5 years, until fairly recently, and I remember one morning I was late to catch the bus to get to work. And I saw the bus, like the street where I walked down to get to the bus stop. You can sometimes see the bus passing as you're walking. And so I saw the bus passing, and I was close enough that I was like, maybe if I make a run for it, I might be able to get there and get on the bus while other passengers are getting on. And I remember as I was running down the street, there was a white couple ahead of me and I realized that I was running. And I know what that might appear as, having double consciousness and recognizing the skin I'm in. And so the thought that I had was I should warn them before I get close to them so that they would not overreact or something. I might not scare them. And so I was like, I yelled out, "I'm sorry," as I was passing. And I remember the white lady got really scared and she like jumped into the other person's arms. And I kept running because I was still late, but I kept thinking on the bus to work what I could have done differently in that situation to not make that person feel afraid. But as you said in your introduction to this question, Boston is an interesting place, and even though it's quite diverse, there's still like this kind of wall up, and there's not a lot that you can do within that context to humanize yourself and make other people not perceive you in a way that you wouldn't perceive yourself. And growing up in the Virgin Islands where it's predominantly Black, I for a very long time in my young life did not contextualize myself always with race first. You know what I mean? And living in US cities have kind of instilled that in me.
Yes.
And so the beginning of the book starts with a officer involved shooting, and it's this really like scary but also like interesting moment that unfolds in different ways throughout the novel. And part of what I was trying to explore there is that that feeling of frustration once I started living in the stateside, and being in these cities and seeing what was happening and starting to recognize more and more how parts of my humanity were being stripped away, and parts of other people's humanity was being stripped away, and the feeling and the anger that I felt. I wanted to represent that in some way, and I felt like the best way to represent that, at least in what I write, was through magic again. And it turns out that the person that was involved, the victim, is a werewolf. And, and I unpack that in different ways, sometimes as a metaphor and sometimes literally, because, it is, the werewolves are real in the book. But it's the approach I chose.
Yeah, again, a fascinating one to choose for sure. What about you, Jamie? What comes up for you?
What comes up for me is who gets to decide what's real and what's not real.
Yeah.
Who gets to decide what's natural and what's supernatural? It's all natural, right? When are you sort of believable and relatable, and when are you a threat? Right? I feel like any story that I tell will absolutely be inherently political.
Yeah.
Because in almost every single institution, system is embedded an idea that I do not have equal value as a human being. So, I think the act of being engaged in my creativity and imagination, and for being receptive to the stories and characters that want to come through me, is not only a sacred and spiritual experience for me, but it's also an experience that sort of harnesses my full humanity, and that humanity is then shared with the characters in the book, whether they look like me or they don't, right? Because then I have to have the example where we are not going to engage as human beings, and that sense of respect and dignity is going to go in all directions, and coming from that place of compassion. That's also political, right? Love is also political, right?
Yes.
So
yes, compassion. Wow, that's a great place to get us into your second selection, Raphael. You mentioned the role of the church, and it's an interesting place to lead us into. Please share with us your second reading.
Definitely. So my story is called God, the Rich Man, and the Poor Man, and it sort of links Jamie's mention of the real and the spiritual being one, and also it addresses your point about the role of the stories, the spiritual stories, as pedagogical tools.
Mm-hmm.
God, the Rich Man, and the Poor Man. Once upon a time, a long time ago, my father spoke to me about a very rich man who had an enormous castle, but he was very greedy. Back then, ancient people said that God was still wandering around the world. It happened that one day, an old man appeared at the rich man's house asking for shelter because it was late at night. The rich man rudely replied, "There's no shelter for anybody here." The old man left. He arrived at a small hut that belonged to a very poor man. The old man asked for shelter to spend the night. The poor man replied, "I would kindly shelter you, but there are no amenities here." The old man replied that he would be appreciative of whatever was given to him. The next morning at dawn, the old man drank coffee and got ready to walk away. Before leaving the house, he told the owners, "Ask for a bliss, and it will be granted." The man asked for health and good luck for him and his family. The next day, when they woke up, they found themselves in a beautiful castle, much better than that of the rich man who had denied hospitality to the old pilgrim. When the wealthy people woke up, they saw a beautiful castle standing next to theirs. They said to themselves, "Let's go there to find out how this has happened. Since yesterday afternoon, there was no castle at dawn, and there is one now." They left at once and asked the owners. The poor man explained that an old man had asked for shelter in their house, and later he gave them a blessing. They asked for health and good luck. The following morning, they found themselves the owner of this castle. "I'll chase him down," said the rich man at once. He started walking. Soon he reached the old man. He challenged him. "How come you gave a castle to that poor man and you did not give me one?" The beggar replied, "I am unable to give you a palace now." "Well, then grant me a wish." "Which one?" "I wish for a palace to replace my castle as soon as I get back." The old man kept on his way. The rich man ran back to his house. Upon arrival, his castle had been turned into ashes. Dios, el rico y el pobre. Me contaba mi papá que había una vez un hombre muy rico, quien tenía un castillo muy grande, pero era muy miserable. En aquel tiempo, decía la gente antigua, Dios todavía andaba por el mundo. Sucedió que un día se apareció un viejo a pedirle posada, porque ya era muy tarde. El Señor le respondió con mal modo, «Aquí no se le da posada a nadie». El viejo se fue. Llegó a la chocita de un hombre muy pobre, a quien pidió posada por aquella noche. El hombre le contestó, «Yo con mucho gusto le daría posada, pero aquí no hay comodidades para ello». El viejo simplemente dijo que él se conformaba con lo que hubiera. Sucedió que otro día, cuando amaneció, el viejo tomó café y se preparó para seguir su camino. Antes de salir de la casa, le dijo a los dueños, «Pidan ustedes una dicha, yo se la concederé». El hombre pidió salud y buena suerte para él y toda su familia. Al otro día, cuando se levantaron, se encontraron en un hermoso castillo, mucho mejor que el castillo del hombre viejo, que le había negado hospitalidad al anciano peregrino. Cuando las gentes ricas se levantaron, vieron aquel hermoso castillo. Se dijeron inmediatamente, vamos allá a ver cómo ha sido esto posible. Ayer tarde no estaba ese castillo en ese sitio y hoy amaneció ahí. Allá se fueron y preguntaron a los dueños. Ellos le contestaron que había estado un viejo quien les pidió posada. Luego les concedió una gracia. Ellos pidieron salud y buena suerte. Al otro día amanecieron dueños de este castillo. Yo me voy detrás de él, dijo el hombre rico. Pronto dio el hombre con el viejo y le enfrentó. ¿Por qué ha sido que le ha dado un castillo al hombre pobre y no me concedió otro a mí? El mendigo le dijo, ahora no puedo. Pues concédame una gracia. ¿Cuál? Deseo que cuando regrese mi castillo sea un palacio. El anciano siguió su camino. El hombre viejo se fue corriendo a su casa. Al llegar, se encontró su castillo convertido en cenizas.
Thank you so much, Rafael.
Okay.
What has your research and writing revealed about the connection between the supernatural apparitions in storytelling and the everyday survival of the people who tell those stories?
So overwhelmingly, these stories, whether they are about supernatural apparitions or divine apparitions, like in this case, the old man is certainly God on earth, they have a very specific purpose of telling people how to live their lives holy. They are very much inspired by biblical stories. Most Puerto Ricans most likely are recognizing that the figure of the old man can be Lazarus, the poor man in the Bible who is granted wishes in death, about being kind, and the rich man is in turn sent to hell for being so mean to the poor, Lazarus, and to everybody else. And so that's what I like to emphasize, that very strong pedagogical inspiration of these stories.
Thank you for that, Rafael. How about we move on to Cadwell with his second selection this afternoon?
Okay, thank you. I'm going to read from chapter 44. All right. In 1995, Hurricane Marilyn hit the Virgin Islands. It was also the year Sandra underwent her first change. In a cover of darkness and storm, they all went out together, her father, her mother, Sandra, and Sonia without her skin. It was the first time Sandra had seen her parents in their animal form, and it took her breath away. Their coats were brown and spotted with black and white. They had large round ears and a thick bushy tail. Their lean, powerful muscles showed under their short fur. Their long teeth gleamed. Her mother was bigger, but they both were quite large, breathtakingly beautiful. Sandra initiated her change, and it was easy, like falling into water. Instinct kicked in after that. They ran down hillsides and through the bush. A few times Sandra was hit by flying debris, but they were also fast healers. She didn't have to slow down. Sonia was even faster than they, somehow managing to avoid any low boughs, briars, or flying debris. She was also screaming the entire time, which alarmed Sandra at first, but then she realized that Sonia was just happy. To her surprise, hearing Sonia's joy amplified her own. They ran and ran, Sonia sitting on top of Sandra occasionally, holding her ears as she cut between trees and hurdled logs and stones. The wind was lifting everything up, and branches and leaves slapped against Sandra, but she couldn't feel them. It was wondrous. The sky was gray-black. She could see the storm raging, a living thing made of wind and rain and lightning. The rain splashed against Sonia, sticking to her in places, and sometimes Sandra could just make Sonia out in her skinless form, the suggestion of muscle fibers, tendons, the hinges of her joints. She was beautiful as she screamed and laughed, her face the shape of a young girl's, but without flesh. Sandra watched her and wasn't afraid. The storm lasted all night and well into the next day. They returned home before sunrise, all curled up in bed together as the hurricane raged outside. They felt strong with it, but they also knew that it would leave devastation in its wake. People and animals had died, the scent of them carrying on the wind. Sonia and Sandra had fallen asleep before Mom and Dad, and they woke up before them. It was midday when they went into their own room together, still tired from their adventure. Sonia had put her skin back on. She looked radiant, her skin giving off a faint glow. "Can I sleep with you?" she asked. "Okay," Sandra said. Sandra lay down first, and then Sonia joined her. Sonia got really close, and Sandra put her arm around her. She responded stiffly at first, but then she relaxed. Sandra calmed down too. Sonia smelled like dirt and rain, and Sandra wondered how since she had left her skin behind. "My mother swam out into the sea and burned up," Sonia said. It was soft, a secret. "How?" Sandra asked. Sonia didn't answer directly, and Sandra knew there was a secret she was too afraid to say. "It hurt a little when I was out today, but it wasn't so bad. The rain isn't so bad," Sonia said. "Yes," Sandra said, not knowing what she meant by "it hurt," but not wanting to push her into a confession. "She didn't know I was there," Sonia said. Back to her mother again. Somehow Sandra understood. "I felt it when she died. Something in me burned out." "You were alone a long time?" Sandra asked. "I don't know how long." They didn't go back to sleep. Sandra asked more questions, and Sonia asked many of her own. By the end of the day, they were sisters.
Thank you. This section from Sandra's story presented a different kind of connection, equally as powerful, the connection between nature and beings, be they human or not. Can you tell us a little bit more about why you made that connection between Hurricane Marilyn and Sandra's change?
Okay, so the truth of it was, I remember Hurricane Marilyn when I was a kid. It was the most memorable hurricane. It knocked out power for 8 months. I was in elementary school at the time, and we had to share schools because some of the other schools were damaged. And so we took, another school came into our school, and we took the mornings and they took the afternoons. And then I would go home, and occasionally we would have enough gas to power a generator and power the house for a little bit. So there's just a lot of vivid memories from that time. Okay. And so when I was thinking about Sandra's own childhood and Sonia's childhood, I thought this would be a really interesting thing to merge with some of my own memories. The other side of it is my aunt used to tell me scary stories sometimes when the power was out. And which would happen often enough, storms or not. And that story, the story I remember the most was the story of the woo-woo. And it was basically a werewolf-like creature that would stalk people during power outages, and you could hear the clicking in the walls and that sort of thing. And it was such a vivid memory for me that when I was thinking about this story for the book, and I was thinking about the kind of monsters I would want to bring into the book, I knew I wanted to bring in the Sukuyan because I'd heard stories about that as a child as well. But I also thought the woo would be a really great monster to bring in. And so Sandra and her family are the woo-woos, and they get their power from storms, which felt naturally to me. It felt natural to me, in opposed to the moon with, werewolf stories. And so integrating some of the scary stories that I heard as a child, and also some of my most vivid experiences of being in storms was an inspiration for this particular section.
Wow, great. I was thinking as you were talking about the vivid memory of the storm, and then Raphael, your piece, that I was actually going to perhaps ask Jamie to flip your selections if it's not too much trouble, and ask you to read the last one, because there is something in the storm in the Explorer that I want to make sure we leave time, enough time for. He is his own type of devastation that he creates in his own way, from his name to his characteristics and actions. Just how you build that character was remarkable. So I'd like you to share from that part, please.
Yes, of course. The explorer was the kind of man who, after pulling into the drive that first time, got out of his car and followed the mother and her children inside the house. Even though, mind you, there was no official invitation. The house took note of this. This was one of the explorer's attributes. He knew when to follow. Once seated at the kitchen table, he began to take inventory of what was not there. No curtains, no paint, no dishes, no pottery, no record player, no plants. Rosalinda, Rafa, and Rafina all looked around the kitchen and saw not what was there and had been there, but what had been missing all along. With the explorer's naming of what was not there, everything seemed to be lacking. Where were the curtains? Why didn't they have paint on the walls? Rosalinda had never felt so studied. Her veins seemed to swell in response. Her temperature became significantly warmer. She poured him a glass of water from the faucet, placed it in front of him. When the explorer's eyes paused from darting about the room, they landed on her. He was seeing her black, too. That was obvious, even if he wasn't calling it out. Rosalinda's heart rate was excessive. You should know that what she heard, in addition to the explorer's listing of what was wrong, was the possibility of him making it right. In effect, what she heard was a list of promises. When the explorer said no paint, she heard that he would be the one doing the painting. That no record player meant he would be the one to locate such a thing, install it, and produce the records needed to fill the house with sound. In this way, she grew more and more excited as he continued with what was not there. Sewing machine, rugs, candles, tapestries, art. He didn't leave once it became dark. They continued to sit around the table, Rafa on his mother's lap, Rafina the closest she'd been to reaching out and touching the large carved wooden cuff on the explorer's wrist. Curiosity kept them pinned to their places. Who was this man? Where did he come from? What was he doing here? Finally, the mother said, "If you're not going to leave, then you're going to need to sleep." "I suppose," he said, his smile opening with all his bright teeth. "Outside in the yard, there's a couch." His smile turned loose. He nodded. "Dreams are best sleeping out there," Rafina said. "Don't tell," Rafa said. "He'll take them all." "Will you?" Rafina asked. "Steal all the dreams?" "I don't know how I could," the explorer said, "when there are more than can ever be counted." "That's not how it works," Rafa said, turning toward his mother. "Is it?" Rosalinda did not respond. That the explorer seemed to have appeared out of nowhere and had nowhere to go made Rosalinda feel a kinship with him. She was imagining the house filled with things. She was imagining him doing it. A man who could make things appear was a magician of sorts, after all, and she wasn't so burdened with her own devastations that she couldn't remember the possibility of magic, especially when it was seated across from her. "Will you leave some dreams for us?" Rafina said, trying again. The explorer lifted the glass of water to his lips and emptied it without pause. Later that first night, Rafa and Rafina watched the explorer from the living room window as he moved the couch so that it faced away from view of the house and managed a makeshift tent around it. Rafina bet Rafa that the explorer would never leave. Rafa bet Rafina that he'd be gone as soon as the rains came. The betting continued. Rafina that their mother would fall in love with him. Rafa that their mother would chase him off with a machete. Rafina that he'd become their father and they'd be a family. Rafa that the memory of the explorer would become so small that they'd step on it like a cockroach and forget he had ever existed. Isn't it something how they both were wrong and they both were right?
Thank you so much for that, Jimmy. Can you tell us a little bit about what it was like to create the character of the explorer?
Yes.
A big one.
Yes, because in stories we have villains, right?
Yeah.
We have the one who causes the harm, and then leaves victims in their wake. And going back to the sense of compassion being a political act, and also compassion being absolutely integral to storytelling and being a writer, and imagining characters, I had to go through many drafts and come to a point where my heart really softened for the explorer. Right. I think what happens ultimately is the explorer can be internalized, the colonizer can be internalized, and then you have your beloveds and your relations acting out, right? That which is continuously villainizing. And so how to, through the sense of compassion, bring about the start of healing, right? Not to excuse his behavior at all, but to continue to keep a space for him to have his story. He doesn't get to take up all of the space,
yes,
but he doesn't lose his space, right?
Yes.
So proportionality became necessary in creating him. That he has influence and direct impact, but that he doesn't get to take over, right? And that we have to find a sense of compassion and tolerance for him. Yeah.
It's a tough call, but I do understand it being necessary to create a balanced narrative, I suppose. Raphael, I will ask you to share the third reading, actually, because I do want to, I think it has been fascinating to hear both the Spanish and the English readings. And so I do want to give you that opportunity to share your final reading with us.
Definitely.
Yeah.
For my final reading, I have the charcoal maker. Once upon a time, there was a very poor man who was a charcoal maker. Every day he prayed to God for a 50-cent surplus to buy a hen, to eat all of it by himself. One day he had 50 cents in savings and he bought a hen. Immediately he began to cook the hen. In the meantime, a well-dressed man appeared in front of him. He asked the charcoal maker for food. The charcoal maker asked him, "Who are you?" The man replied, "I am Luck. I have come to help you eat your hen." The charcoal man answered him, "No, sir, go away. I will not give you my hen. Luck only protects wealthy people." Luck went away. At once, a poorly dressed man arrived. The charcoal burner asked him, "Who are you?" The mysterious man answered, "I am Death. I have come to help you eat your hen." The charcoal burner immediately replied, "Come in, sir, and eat the hen with me. I will indeed give my hen to you. Death does not choose. Whenever you come, rich and poor alike are taken away. Unlike luck, who is a dog that does not follow its master. El carbonero. Había una vez un hombre muy pobre quien era carbonero. Todos los días pedía a Dios que hubiese un día que le sobraran 50 centavos para comprar una gallina, para comérsela él solo. Llegó el día en el que le sobraron 50 centavos y compró la gallina. Enseguida se puso a guisarla. Cuando estaba guisándola, llegó un hombre muy bien vestido y le pidió comida. El carbonero le preguntó, ¿quién es usted? El hombre le contestó, yo soy la suerte. Vengo a ayudarte a comer tu gallina. El carbonero le respondió, no, señor, váyase ahora mismo. Yo no le doy mi gallina. La suerte solamente protege al rico. La suerte se fue. Al momento llegó otro hombre, también mal puesto. El carbonero le preguntó, ¿quién es usted? El misterioso hombre contestó, yo soy la muerte. Vengo a ayudarte a comer tu gallina. El carbonero le dijo inmediatamente, suba usted para que nos la comamos. A usted sí le doy mi gallina, porque la suerte no escoge. Cuando usted viene, lo mismo se lleva al rico que se lleva al pobre. No como la suerte, que es un perro que sigue a su amo.
Thank you so much, Raphael. And just before I ask you a question about that and your readings this afternoon, I just want to let everyone know that we are a little bit over time and we will be going till about 4:30. So happy to have you stay with us. And if you have to leave us at this point, we thank you so much for joining our discussion this afternoon. Raphael, you have shared, as I mentioned earlier, all of your readings have both been read in Spanish and English. I'm wondering why was that choice important to you, and sort of what is your intention behind it, if you mind sharing?
So using one of your questions, my choice was completely ideological. When I came across this collection, and again, remember, this is the largest oral folklore collection from any Spanish-speaking country or territory, even today.
Wow.
In my mind, as a literary critic, Boas and Mason, Boas, the founding father of American anthropology, in 1915 in Puerto Rico, was predicting that Puerto Ricans were going to lose Spanish as their native language. Thus, this large collection of oral folklore. Of course, it didn't happen. Señor Boas, we still speak Spanish on the island of Puerto Rico as our first language. So that was my first ideological position. The second ideological position, it was my most humble legacy to the Jíbaro culture that has made me who I am. I am first generation San Juanero, someone who was born in San Juan, from parents both coming from the countryside. From them, very much like Cadwell, I heard stories about the countryside. And those stories ideologically have made me who I am. And I suspect, and I know for a fact that it has also made who many Puerto Ricans are, whether they are on the island or in the United States, because many of these stories have traveled to the United States and are very well known among Puerto Ricans, first generation, second generation, or even third generation Puerto Ricans.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. It's very exciting to hear, and I hope inspiring to those who may be thinking about writing in this tradition to bring in their own languages into their work as well, and it not having to be only in English, and sharing with the world. Cadwell, I would love to have you read your last selection for us this evening.
Okay. If do we still have enough time? I would be happy to yield. If
you would be happy to yield. I mean, we have a little bit of time. What I may do is I will cut our final sort of all person question and just close out with your reading and then Jamie's last reading, and then we'll end there.
Okay. All right, so I'm gonna read another section from Sandra's part of the book, from chapter 45. Right. Despite their name, the were-dogs of the Antilles, also known colloquially as woos, bear no connection to the domestic dog. Their animal counterpart is a descendant of the African wild dog, the only extant member of the genus Lycaon, which diverged from Kuan and Canis 1.7 million years ago. Sandra's family descended from the West African wild dog in particular, nearly extinct in the wild and also in the human realm. An old magic had made them lost during the Middle Passage. As with werewolves and the moon, were-dog transformations are linked to storm events. The were-dogs are especially powerful during hurricane season, able to change at will more easily than at other times of the year. Were-dogs had endured not through subterfuge like other monsters in other places, but through proliferation of their stories. Everyone on Sandra's island knew of the woo-woo, even if they hadn't seen one. A child, breathless in excitement and fear, could tell you all about the woo-woo. Click, 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 they'd whisper to each other during a storm or power outage, mimicking the sound of claws on walls, windows, and doors. The woo-woo coming for you. Sandra hated the way her kind was portrayed in these stories when she was a child. But as an adult, she knew that the stories were a blessing, a spell of protection. Stories of were-dogs and woo-woos and other strange creatures known by many names existed on all the islands Sandra had ever visited. Most people outgrew true belief in monsters by adulthood, but even adults knew not to go outside at night during a power outage, go past a certain house, or answer to whispers in the dark. Monsters existed in a liminal space of half belief and practical superstition. Even folks who claimed not to believe in God knew not to tempt devils. Superstition provided a certain kind of freedom, allowed a certain kind of power, which is probably why Sandra never remembered feeling fear for her family's safety. When her parents went on their trip to New York, she wasn't worried. Sonia and Sandra were staying at their uncle's place, and she remembered being happy that they were gone, at least for a little while. A week passed, then another. Her uncle didn't seem worried, so Sonia and she weren't either. In the third week, he pulled them aside and said, "We can't find your parents." They spent months looking for them. On Sonia's 15th birthday, a birthday their parents had given her, Sonia asked Sandra for the blood. "Mom and Dad used to give it to me," she said, "to keep me from hunting." Sandra knew that her sister needed blood, but somehow never knew that she fed on their parents. Sandra didn't want to know, but it was a little too late for that. Sandra agreed to give her the blood. They were sisters, and now they would be something more. That first time, Sonia unlatched her tongue. Sandra marveled at the gleaming black thing rolling out of her mouth, the thin, sharp tip curving up to meet Sandra at eye level. She'd never seen Sonia's tongue in this form before and wasn't prepared for its strangeness. She was dizzy already just looking at it. Sandra didn't see when it reeled back and stabbed into her neck, but then she saw the blood being pulled up through the organ into Sonia's parted mouth, into the deepest darkness. Sonia's throat undulated with wave after wave of swallowed blood. Sandra had only a moment to feel fear before Sonia unlatched from her and opened her mouth wide. The tongue disappeared back inside, but she couldn't close her mouth completely. Sandra shivered. Afterwards, Sonia asked to be held. "I need the blood," she said, "and the love." Sandra didn't ask what the second part meant. Somehow she knew. Sonia had been different once they adopted her. The love of family had been just as nourishing as the blood she fed on. Sandra let her sister fall into her arms. They continued this ritual for a year without trouble. It was too easy to last that way forever. Eventually, though, something shifted, and little by little, Sonia needed more blood each time. One night, the worst finally happened. The feeding started the usual way, but it went on too long. Sandra waited for the expected end, but lost consciousness before it arrived. When she woke up, her head was a storm cloud raging, and Sonia was still on top of her, holding her, drinking her in. Sonia's skin felt loose. She had a sudden thought that nothing would be left but her skin and bones. There had been times in Sonia's life when she was afraid, but nothing before or since would ever come close to this terror. Sandra hadn't noticed when she started screaming. She'd fallen into it and became aware only as the pit of despair stretched beneath her. It could have been minutes or hours before Sonia noticed and fell off her. Her eyes were wide, Sandra remembered, a mirror of horror. Many apologies followed. Sandra accepted them all, but it wasn't a thing one could mend that way. Neither of them brought up feeding again. It became a wedge between them. Guilt, shame, and resentment filled that place, a tight knot that couldn't be unwound. Sandra could sometimes see the shame in her sister's eyes despite any attempt to remedy it. In Sonia's eyes, Sandra could also see her own fear reflected back. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Cardwell. And I just want to say, I want to end with Jamie's reading because I want everyone that is listening to be convinced that you need to buy these books today. Once you disconnect from this call, the link is up from the BCLF team. This is a sacred space, and I want to make sure that we hear as much as we can from all of our writers in case you need further convincing. So Jamie, please take us home with your final selection.
Thank you so much. Rosalinda had lived here for nearly 10 years, and still every time she entered the plaza, she would stop and take it all in as if it were the day she'd arrived. She did so on this day as well. The cottonwood trees were so massive and commanding, it was as if they were pinning the plaza to the earth. Crows flicked and twirled through the air on their jaunts above. Day laborers passed through, hurrying to clock in. The original enduring ones tended to their wares and watched, amused. Tourists, coerced by turquoise painted boots and cowboy hats, hauled bags, bought more and more, argued about price. The adobe storefront walls facing the plaza created edges not unlike a box. Inside the plaza, families sprawled out on the grass, lapping at ice cream cones. In the center, a fountain with multiple tiers of concrete bowls brimming with water, coins lining the bottom. The mother slipped off her shoes, stepped onto a bench, toes gripping wooden slats, palms balancing on each child's head, and surrendered her eyes to the sight of the mountains, both near and far. She inhaled deeply, pulling all that she could see deep into her body. The strength of the mountains, the strength of the sky. It was not where she was from, this was true, but it was her home. She had claimed it, and we could say it claimed her as well. She was alive. Her children were alive. She had a son in whose face she saw her father's and her grandfather's faces, her brothers' and her uncles' faces, men who had done their best to protect her. There were the gifts of the house, the garden, the rain every afternoon during monsoons that blessed her whether she believed she deserved it or not. Her memory had grown over with scar tissue, which meant the function of her mind kept to the pathways that were most useful, most relevant. And her body, the small, sturdy package of it, was a paradox of fierce survival and fragility. But in this place, Ciudad de Tres Hermanas, she could pretend she understood what it meant to be safe. The gallery owners wanted to know why the mother's portraits were so mournful. Again, the same images? Who were these people supposed to be anyway? What else did she have to show? Any animals? Landscapes sold well. These questions did not keep Rosalinda from making the weekly visits to her portraits to the various galleries, occupying nearly every street in the city. It did not keep the gallery owners from asking the same questions. It did not keep them from saying no. She would point to the portraits of her family, all of them men, all of them gone. The value of a family taken, wasted. Look at their faces, she'd tell them. Don't you see animals? Don't you see landscapes? They wanted to know if she was Indian. They could promote her along with the others if that was the case. They'd have a better idea of what to do with her, although if she could do one with a coyote or a buffalo, that would help. Not your kind of Indian, she had told them, not the kind in the movies. Her face was marked by her people, people who lived high in the mountains with the steady music of rain, the unimaginable palette of birds, and where orchids seemed to form in mid-air, where trees created vast tents over the land. This was where the volcano rose up. In its crater, the lake. At the bottom, through the hole down the tunnel, was the dwelling place. In the dwelling place lived the uninterrupted memory of the people. There's no way for you to know that this dwelling place was where the stories they sang and repeated to one another and to themselves lived. It's likely you understand this as metaphor. Because of this tendency to rely on your mental constraints, you will never truly understand. Inside your bones are the cells that can feel the vibration of all kinds of stories. Their humming often escapes you. This is not entirely your fault, but the disbelief is. Start there.
Well, if that is not a calling, a cry for writing our stories and sharing our history and our truths, then I don't know what is. I thank you so much.
Beautiful.
This was the best kind of Saturday to spend this time with all of you in this space. This was fantastic. I really, really enjoyed it. And I know that I'm hearing from our audience that they've been enjoying this conversation as well. Thank you again to BCLF for organizing a wonderful festival and this panel in particular, and for bringing us together so we can have this conversation. The festival continues tonight. The next event will start at 6 p.m. I belong to the House of Music. It's always a fan favorite, with Attila Springer and a host of writers speaking about their influences with their music in their writing and how they approach their craft. So we hope that you can join us for that event at 6 p.m. Have a good evening, and thank you so much again for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank
You
you
so much.
It's an honor.
See me way.